Get ready, get set, and hold on. It's going to be one hell of a ride. Good morning. This is the Mouth of Matuszak radio show. I'm your host, Paul-Gregory Matuszak, for this Monday, August 4th. Welcome to a new week. It's Monday. Time to roll up them sleeves and get to work. Earn all that stuff. Start working on, putting forth your labors there and bringing forth what will become the fruit of your labors that you can enjoy come the weekend. Can't have an enjoyable weekend unless you've done some good work. Get that sense of accomplishment, that sense of pride, and, of course, the items in your wallet to kind of show for it. Well, not necessarily in your wallet, your house, your car, the food on your table, your kids, and if they're in a school that's not a government-run indoctrination center, the tuition and education that they're getting. And even if they're in a government indoctrination center, it's still your money that's paying for it, if you're working, that is, and earning a living, because you're paying your taxes, which then go for that. But we'll address a little bit more on that a little bit later on. It's Monday. We need to start the week off on a high note. So, without further ado, looking for high notes.
You don't have a right to know everything in a separation of powers government, my friend. That is the difference between a parliamentary government and a separation of powers government.
I just cannot get enough of that ludicrous comment that came out of Eleanor Norton's mouth. Lord, woman, get thee to a school. Go repeat 8th grade. Pay special attention in the civics classes, if they still even do those anymore. I said a high note. Of course, you want to start the week off on a high note, and she was evidently pretty high when she started flapping her gums, either that or she really is that ignorant of the Constitution and what it means. Speaking of ignorant in the Constitution and what it means, I was trolling, to use that term, looking through some of the comments on some of the writings by some of my fellow contributors at a couple of the sites where I write at. And on one article by Eric Reed, it's brought a lot of attention. And if you haven't read it yet, if you're one of the few people who haven't gone and looked at it yet, it's his article about the mothers demand angst against all Americans who like the Constitution, MDA, and what their members up in Austin did to counter a Come and Take It Texas, which is an open carry advocate group. It's a Second Amendment advocate group. What these women did up there by bearing it all, as it were, above the waist, and trying to somehow make showing their memories in public to be akin to the open carry of weapons. And I really could care less whether a woman walks around bare-breasted or not. Now, do I care if my wife does it? I don't even know if that would bother me necessarily. I don't think her walking around that way would bother me. I think some of the comments other people might make would bother me. But, she'd be the primary person to take any action if people were saying the wrong thing. That's her place. Of course, I'd be right by her side and defend her. But anyway. Now, my kid, different story. She's not an adult yet, so I can tell her, keep it covered. So, yeah, not so much. There's some sickos out there. But anyway, I digress. on there has some interesting comments going back and forth. And there's one commentator or person leaving her opinions who goes by the moniker of Pam. And she has left some really loony stuff. Now, she decided to cite Federalist 29, which is kind of interesting, because she cited it to give Hamilton's idea of militia. And what Hamilton was trying to do in Federalist 29 was identify the reason for having some form of a standing army or militia, and trying to justify having Congress being in charge of funding it, having it be national at the federal level, and having a commander-in-chief in the executive branch who would be in charge of it. So he's justifying having a standing military. That was the whole purpose behind Federalist 29, or at least the part that she was quoting. And she was trying to use it against the Second Amendment. The issue with that is twofold. Number one, to accept that as an argument against the Second Amendment applying to everybody, which, by the way, the 14th Amendment kind of ends that entire argument right off the bat, because it says if it applies to one, it applies to all. That's what the 14th Amendment says. But in order to assume that the Second Amendment only applies to militia, first of all, you would have to assume that the Founding Fathers didn't understand grammar, and that their grammar rules back then weren't as strict as they were, and were as loose as they become in some ways today. And by making that assumption, they would assume that the comma in there is ablative. Kind of like some people believe that the Oxford comma is ablative. But you make that comma ablative, and it changes the meaning of the sentence if it's not there. It really does. The comma is not ablative. It's put there very purposefully to make sure that you understand the meaning. Because the federal government has to have militia in order to defend our nation. Well, we had just fought wars to defeat a tyranny. And during those wars, one of the very first things about it was the government soldiers of the time before the revolution, which of course was the British soldiers, at one point became the only ones allowed to own certain types of arms. And they were going around and confiscating them. And then when they attempted to confiscate them in Lexington and Concord, that of course sparked the shot around the world. So looking at that incident, looking at there really shouldn't be any weapons that are reserved only for the military, because that would make the military, or could potentially make the military, an arm of tyranny. But if all the people are allowed to arm themselves to the same extent, well then the chances of the military turning on the general populace are reduced. The chances of the federal government going tyrannical and using the military to impose its will upon the people is reduced. That was the intent behind it. And of course, then goes into the whole common sense ideals of you have the natural right to defend yourself, your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of happiness, your children, your family, in their lives and their pursuits of happiness. So that all gets boiled into that, added into that mix to top it off. Which furthers the claim for the Second Amendment. But Pam tried to say, well, you're not part of the militia. And this is why. It's because of what Alexander Hamilton said. She even tried to direct it at me. And folks, that's hilarious. I'm a military retiree. By law, I'm still a member of the military. I'm assigned to a retiree unit based, I want to say it's in St. Louis, I think. I have to recheck my paperwork or my orders, but I'm still assigned to a unit. I'm still military. I spent 24 years in, active. And so I'm technically still part of the militia, the federal militia. So her her claims that I'm not, she can stuff it. Other people that she was making the same kind of statements to also belong to other militia. Among the other militia a person can belong to, if they're a police officer, if they're a reserve police officer, if they are within a municipality where the sheriff has the power to deputize anybody in order to do this, conduct security operations or conduct an investigation or secure an area so an investigation could be done, you're an active militia. If you're in a state who has a state constitution that allows for that state to have a militia and has a statement in there, you're part of the state militia. If you're part of the member of the National Guard, whether it's active or inactive ready reserve, you're part of the militia. If you signed up for the selective service, you're part of the militia. Think about that. And that's selective service, otherwise known as the draft. If you took ROTC in school, you're part of the militia. Several states have a state-level guard. They're not National Guard, they're state guards. Texas is one, Arizona is another, Georgia is another, to name 3 off the bat. If you remember those, you are militia. And in some states, they have laws that say every able-bodied adult is a member of the militia. And then there's no stipulations on what able-bodied means. It just says able-bodied. So, that pretty much lends to most citizens, or most adult citizens, being a member of a militia. So, with that in mind, how does Pam's argument fare, especially when she says in Alexander Hamilton's opinion, in order to be militia you have to meet regularly and train and drill? And by the way, once upon a time, they used to do that. Civil defense. They're called the civil defense call-ups or rosters, where every able-bodied man had to show up in town square and be acknowledged on the rolls, and then they'd do a little bit of practice drilling. It was like once every few months or maybe only once a year, but it was regular back then. It is not any longer. Used to be that way. Still, the laws on the books state that we're militia. So, go on over to that article on BuzzPo. And folks, leave your opinion one way or the other. This is just mine and my take on things. Am I looking at history and the laws and some common sense and doing some logical syllogisms and analysis? But I think Pam is out to lunch and grasping at straws, especially when she is attempting to use one of the Federalist Papers in order to try to disprove stuff that's actually written in other ones. Mason wrote a few things concerning the Second Amendment in some of his papers. I think John Jay may have. I'd have to double check, but I do know Mason did. So, sorry, not Mason, Madison. I don't know why I've got the wrong name bouncing around in my head. Probably because I have a family member by the name of Mason. But I mean Madison. James Madison, of course. I apologize for that mix-up, folks. But speaking about veterans and militia, this is something true to my heart here. I've been playing this last couple of days, but this is Governor Perry talking about what Texas is doing for its veterans. So you all just take a quick listen to this. If you are from Texas and you're a veteran, or if you know veterans in Texas, or you know people who are in the military who happen to be serving in Texas, or they're serving elsewhere and plan to come to school for Texas after they get out of if they leave the service, go ahead and take a look at this. Pass the word along.
Our men and women in uniform have valiantly served and profoundly sacrificed for our nation. That's why Texas is expanding staffing at the Texas Veterans Hotline with experts trained to help veterans deal with the VA. Callers can learn what they qualify for, and in the most urgent cases, TVC experts will work directly with the VA to help veterans get the answers and care they need and deserve. Call the hotline at 1-800-252-VETS. Thank you.
And if you didn't catch that number for one reason or another, that's 1-800-252-VETS, or VETS. So go ahead and pass the word along if you know somebody who's in need or doesn't even know what they're eligible for or not eligible for as far as their benefits go. And you're living in Texas, of course, or somehow affiliated with Texas, or like I said, you're active duty or know somebody who's active duty and they plan on getting out, even if they're just going to come to school here. Kind of a good number to call and find out what their benefits are coming from Texas itself and what Texas Veterans Bureau will do to help navigate the corruption and red tape and epistemic failures within the federal VA. Texas is doing its best to help. Of course, nothing is perfect, but at least there's some help out there. Now, speaking about Rick Perry, something that's going to draw a little bit of attention to him is he wrote an op-ed, an editorial, which was originally published up there in Austin, and it's free for people to reprint as long as they say, hey, Governor Rick Perry wrote this. But he wrote this editorial, and I'm going to read it to y'all folks real quickly, but he's throwing his 2 cents into the whole Israel versus the Palestinian terrorists that have kind of taken over Gaza and have started all this recent violence and stuff. So anyway, these are the words of Governor Perry here. It's difficult to imagine the terror that the people of Israel must live with every day. For Israelis, and at any given moment, a missile might be detected rocketing toward a residential neighborhood. A bomber may detonate him or herself in a crowded public place, and terrorists sent by Hamas might infiltrate their borders through secret tunnels to kidnap their children or kill them. Thousands of miles away, it might be convenient to criticize Israel for having the temerity to defend itself against these murderous terrorist attacks. Those of us who have been to Israel and have seen the effects of these attacks firsthand have a deeper understanding of what the Israeli people are being forced to endure. On my own visits to Israel, I visited with families who were afraid to let their children play outside, and seen the fortified playgrounds where they can go. I've seen the rubble of structures brought down by missile strikes, and looked in the eyes of people who live with the threat of violence day in and day out. Even beyond that, we understand the ongoing conflict between Hamas and Israel is merely part of a much larger conflict, one with far-ranging implications that, with nations like Iran watching, can affect the lives of every person on the globe. To begin, anyone tempted to suggest Israel is using a disproportionate amount of force to defend itself needs to remember the origins of this latest round of violence. It's Hamas that continues to launch rockets, despite Israel's willingness to discuss and abide by ceasefires. It's Hamas that is using Palestinians as human shields to protect their leaders and their arsenals, and preserve their extensive system of tunnels. And it's Hamas that would, if given the opportunity, take the life of every Israeli within range of thousands of rockets in its arsenal. The overwhelming success of Israel's Iron Dome defense system has been the only thing to prevent the deaths of thousands of Israelis, and changes nothing in Hamas's deadly intent. Unlike the circumstances, Israel's response has been anything but disproportionate. In fact, Israel has taken extraordinary, even unprecedented measures to protect as many lives as possible in its efforts to disarm and disable Hamas. The United States must take its lead regarding this conflict, bringing the international community together to demand a total removal of every missile in Gaza, as well as the complete destruction of the tunnel network being used by Hamas terrorists. To facilitate this, the United States must use the tools available to us diplomatically and continue to support the